Racist cop attacks black woman in court. The room suddenly goes silent. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. The courtroom in downtown Chicago carried the quiet weight of a place where decisions changed lives. A room chilled by steady air conditioning and lined with polished oak benches worn smooth by decades of waiting hands. At the center of it all stood Monica Harris, a black woman in her late 30s, composed and still, her posture straight as she faced forward. She wore a simple navy blazer, no jewelry meant to draw attention, her hair neatly pulled back, her expression calm in a way that seemed almost out of place. Around her, the low murmur of the gallery ebbed and flowed like a restless tide, whispers brushing against one another before dissolving into uneasy silence. Officer Daniel Wright stood several feet away, his uniform crisp, his stance rigid with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him. His presence was loud without a single word, the subtle shifting of his weight, the deliberate way his gaze lingered where it shouldn't. To him, this was routine, another moment inside a system he trusted would always tilt in his favor. The judge had not yet entered, and the delay stretched thin, filling the space with an unspoken tension that pressed against every chest. Monica felt it, but she did not react. She had learned long ago that stillness could speak louder than protest, that patience, when chosen, was not weakness but control. A bailiff cleared his throat, papers rustled, and somewhere behind her a wooden bench creaked under nervous movement. Officer Wright took a step closer, his shoes tapping sharply against the tiled floor, the sound cutting through the quiet like a challenge. Several heads turned. A few people exchanged glances, but said nothing, their eyes quickly retreating to safer places. Monica kept her gaze forward, focused on the seal mounted behind the judge's bench, an emblem meant to represent fairness, though it often felt like a reminder of how fragile that promise could be. Wright's voice broke the hush, edged with authority and impatience, directed at her, but meant for everyone to hear. The words themselves were not loud, but the tone carried an unmistakable message of dismissal, of assumption, of a line being crossed because he believed there would be no consequence. The air seemed to tighten. A clerk paused mid-motion. A lawyer near the aisle froze with a pen hovering above a legal pad. Monica felt the eyes on her now, waiting, measuring, expecting a reaction that would confirm every quiet bias already formed in their minds. She did not give them one. Instead, she inhaled slowly, a steady breath that grounded her, and let the moment stretch. That pause, brief as it was, changed something. The room sensed it before it understood it. The confidence in Wright's posture faltered just enough to be noticed, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his expression as the silence grew heavier rather than breaking. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the courtroom itself had decided to hold its breath, unaware that this was only the beginning of a moment that would soon redefine who truly held power within its walls. The silence did not break right away. It lingered, stretching across the courtroom like a held note that no one dared interrupt. The air felt heavier now, not from noise but from restraint, from the unspoken awareness that something had shifted. Monica Harris remained exactly where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes forward, her breathing slow and measured. She was acutely aware of every detail around her, the faint hum of the ventilation overhead, the subtle squeak of a chair as someone adjusted their weight, the distant sound of traffic filtering through thick courthouse walls. This room was designed to project order, yet beneath the polished surfaces lived decades of imbalance, and Monica knew that history well. Officer Daniel Wright cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended, a reflex meant to reclaim attention. His confidence, once effortless, now required effort, and that alone unsettled him. He glanced toward the gallery, expecting reassurance in familiar expressions, but found faces carefully neutral, eyes avoiding commitment. Authority thrived on acknowledgement, and in that moment, acknowledgement was absent. The clerk at the side table shuffled a stack of files, her movements cautious, as though afraid to draw focus. A junior attorney near the aisle glanced at Monica, then quickly looked away, heart pounding with the uncomfortable realization that this scene did not match the predictable rhythm he had come to expect from this courthouse. Monica felt the weight of assumptions pressing inward, the same assumptions she had encountered in offices, hallways, and rooms far less formal than this one. She did not challenge them aloud. She let them sit, letting the tension expose itself without her help. Years earlier, she had learned that systems often revealed their weaknesses when forced to confront quiet certainty. The judge's door remained closed, a small but significant detail that left the room without its usual anchor. Without that presence, hierarchy relied entirely on habit, and habit was fragile. Wright shifted again, straightening his shoulders, reminding himself of his badge, his years on the force, the countless times situations like this had resolved in his favor. He told himself that silence meant compliance, that stillness meant submission. Yet something about Monica's composure resisted that narrative. She was not frozen. She was waiting. A murmur stirred briefly among the spectators before dying out, as if instinct itself warned against speaking. One man folded his arms tightly, another clasped her purse, and a third stared at the floor, suddenly aware of his own discomfort. Monica sensed it all, the collective uncertainty, the question forming but not yet voiced. Who was she, really, to remain so unmoved? The seal behind the bench caught the light, its engraved words reflecting softly, a reminder of ideals often quoted but unevenly applied. Monica allowed her gaze to rest there for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, though her thoughts were clear and focused. She had walked into this room knowing exactly how it would feel to stand here, knowing how quickly dignity could be tested and how easily it could be mistaken for weakness. Officer Wright opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, the moment slipping from his control as the quiet deepened instead of breaking. Somewhere in the back of the room, a phone vibrated once and was quickly silenced. Time seemed to slow, measured not in seconds but in awareness. The courtroom was no longer merely a place of procedure. It had become a mirror, reflecting every assumption, every imbalance, every unspoken rule back onto those who relied on them. And Monica Harris, still calm, still silent, stood at the center of it, allowing the room to confront itself. Monica Harris had learned long before that the way people watch you often revealed more than what they said, and in that courtroom, the watching had intensified. Eyes lingered now, not with open judgment, but with curiosity sharpened by unease. She stood with quiet composure, her presence steady, as if the room revolved around her stillness. To anyone who did not know her, she might have appeared like any other woman summoned into a legal process she did not control, yet there was a subtle authority in the way she carried herself, a confidence not borrowed from the room, but brought into it. The faint reflection of the overhead lights caught along the polished floor, tracing clean lines that led toward the bench, and Monica followed those lines with her gaze, grounding herself in the order they promised. Officer Daniel Wright felt the shift even as he resisted acknowledging it. He adjusted his belt, a habitual gesture meant to reinforce his role, and glanced once more toward the doors where the judge would soon enter. Delay had never favored him. He was used to momentum, to moments moving quickly enough that doubt had no time to form. Now time stretched. Monica sensed his impatience without looking at him, reading it in the sharp exhale, the slight tightening of his jaw. She knew that impatience often grew when certainty began to crack. A court reporter paused her typing, fingers hovering above the keys, uncertain whether to capture a moment defined more by absence than action. Somewhere near the back, a woman pressed her lips together, as if holding back a thought she was not yet ready to confront. Monica's thoughts remained clear, her focus disciplined. She remembered the countless rooms she had entered where assumptions formed before introductions, where silence was mistaken for consent and calm mistaken for compliance. She had learned to let others reveal themselves first, to allow the weight of their expectations to settle until they became visible to everyone else as well. The seal behind the bench seemed to loom larger now, its promise of justice echoing silently through the space. Monica's posture did not change, but her awareness sharpened. This was the moment when people began to sense that the story they had imagined might not be complete. Wright shifted his stance again, scanning the room as if searching for support, but the faces he met offered none. Even those who had once nodded along now avoided his gaze, drawn instead to the quiet gravity at the center of the room. The clerk cleared her throat softly, then stopped, realizing the sound only underscored the tension. Monica took another slow breath, feeling the steady rhythm of it remind her why she was here. She had not come to react. She had come to observe, to let the imbalance show itself without interruption. The judge's door remained closed, and in that absence, the structure everyone relied on felt suddenly fragile. Monica understood that power often depended on belief, and belief could waver in silence. Wright's confidence, once automatic, now required reinforcement, and each second without affirmation made that task harder. Monica did not smile, did not frown, did not move. She allowed the room to fill the space she left untouched. Somewhere deep in the courthouse, a clock ticked, marking time in a way that felt louder than any spoken word. The courtroom was no longer simply waiting for proceedings to begin. It was waiting for clarity, for an answer to an unspoken question that had settled over everyone present. And as Monica Harris stood there, calm and resolute, it became increasingly clear that she was not waiting for the room. The room was waiting for her. The tension that had been quietly building now began to press outward, no longer contained by stillness alone. Officer Daniel Wright felt it and moved to counter it, lifting his chin and shifting his stance as if reclaiming space that had slipped from his grasp. His voice carried again, sharper than before, cutting through the quiet with an edge of impatience that revealed more than authority ever could. He addressed Monica Harris directly, his tone clipped and dismissive, framed as instruction but delivered as judgment, drawing a line meant to remind her and everyone else where he believed she belonged. A few heads turned instinctively, conditioned to follow the sound of confidence even when it rang hollow. Monica did not flinch. She remained steady, her expression unchanged, though the air around her felt tighter, charged by the attempt to provoke a response. The gallery stirred uneasily. Someone shifted in their seat. Another person exhaled slowly, as if realizing too late that this moment was becoming something more than procedural. Wright took the lack of response as defiance, his words growing firmer, his posture more rigid as he leaned into the role he had relied on for years. He referenced rules, decorum, expectations, speaking as though the framework of the court itself stood behind him, unquestioned and absolute. Yet with each sentence, the imbalance became clearer, the contrast between his urgency and Monica's composure sharpening in the minds of those watching. A court clerk glanced up, eyes flicking between them, then quickly returned to her papers, uncertain where neutrality ended and complicity began. Monica listened without interruption, absorbing not just the words but the assumptions beneath them. She had heard variations of this tone before, in conference rooms, hallways, and offices where her presence had been measured before her credentials ever were. She knew how easily authority could mistake itself for entitlement. Still, she offered nothing back, no argument, no explanation, allowing the disparity to speak for itself. Wright's frustration became visible now, a tightening around the eyes, a slight flush beneath the collar of his uniform. He glanced toward the bench again, then back to Monica, as though hoping the room would validate him simply because it always had. But the room remained suspended, unwilling to play its part. A murmur rippled briefly before dissolving, replaced by an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than before. Monica shifted her weight subtly, not in retreat, but in readiness, grounding herself as the moment stretched. She was aware that escalation did not always arrive with volume. Sometimes it arrived through insistence, through the refusal to recognize restraint as strength. Wright's voice softened only slightly, adopting a condescending calm that carried its own message, one that suggested patience was being granted rather than exercised. That, more than anything, drew the attention of the gallery. A young man in the back frowned. An older woman folded her hands tighter in her lap. The assumptions on display were no longer subtle. Monica's gaze lifted at last, not toward Wright, but toward the space beyond him, toward the bench that still stood empty. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, yet it shifted the energy in the room. Wright paused mid-sentence, unsettled by the realization that he was no longer controlling the narrative. The silence returned, deeper. Now, shaped by the recognition that the line he had tried to enforce was not holding. The courtroom, once predictable, felt suddenly exposed, and in that exposure, the imbalance he relied on stood plainly revealed. The courtroom began to notice the smaller details now, the ones that had been easy to miss when attention was fixed solely on authority and resistance. A thin folder rested against Monica Harris's side, unmarked and worn at the edges, the kind of thing that looked ordinary enough to be ignored yet deliberate enough to belong exactly where it was. She had not opened it, had not drawn attention to it, but its presence registered with a few careful observers. A senior clerk near the bench glanced at it once, then again, her expression tightening before she quickly masked it behind professional neutrality. Officer Daniel Wright did not see the exchange. His focus remained narrow, fixed on the expectation that the moment would eventually bend back in his favor. Monica remained silent, her composure unbroken, but her awareness extended outward, taking in the subtle shifts that signaled the room was no longer unified. A lawyer seated near the aisle leaned back slightly, studying her with a new interest, noting the absence of fear in her posture, the lack of nervous movement in her hands. People accustomed to pressure often recognized it in others, and the recognition unsettled them. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now, filling the spaces where conversation refused to return. A bailiff adjusted his stance, eyes flicking briefly toward the doors behind the bench, then back to Monica, as if measuring the distance between what he assumed and what he did not yet understand. Monica's gaze lowered for a moment, not in submission, but in calculation, her eyes resting briefly on the floor before lifting again. That small movement did not go unnoticed. Wright shifted again, interpreting stillness as defiance, unaware that the room had begun to read it differently. The assumptions that once carried him now felt exposed, their weight pressing back against him rather than supporting him. A woman in the gallery tilted her head slightly, noticing how Monica stood without fidgeting, without the small tells of someone overwhelmed. The realization was quiet but powerful. People who had been waiting for her to break now found themselves waiting for something else. The unmarked folder seemed heavier by the second, its very ordinariness hinting at intention. Monica did not reach for it. She did not need to. She understood the power of allowing others to wonder. Wright spoke again, his tone measured but strained, reinforcing boundaries he believed were being tested. Yet even as he spoke, a subtle hesitation crept in, a pause where certainty once lived. His eyes flicked briefly toward the clerk, then back to Monica, searching for confirmation that the rules he cited still applied as he understood them. The clerk avoided his gaze. That avoidance landed harder than any spoken challenge. Monica felt the shift ripple outward. The courtroom was beginning to sense that this moment had layers, that the imbalance on display was not accidental, but observed, documented, and perhaps even anticipated. The seal behind the bench caught the light again, its inscription reflecting faintly across the polished wood, and for a brief second it seemed less like a symbol and more like a question. Monica's calm did not come from uncertainty. It came from preparation. She had stood in rooms like this before, where power relied on habit and silence to sustain itself. She had learned that when habit faltered, truth often followed. Wright's words trailed off, the end of his sentence dissolving into the quiet as he realized the room was no longer responding as expected. The audience did not shift back into complacency. They watched, attentive now, aware that something had been set in motion without a single dramatic gesture. The folder remained closed. Monica remained silent, and yet the courtroom felt undeniably changed, as though a line had been drawn not on the floor, but in the collective awareness of everyone present. Monica Harris did not need to look at the clock to know how much time had passed, because moments like this had their own measure, counted not in seconds but in resolve. The longer the room waited, the clearer her purpose became, even if she never spoke it aloud. Her silence was intentional, shaped by experience, by years spent understanding how power listened only when it felt observed. She let her thoughts settle, recalling other rooms with different walls but the same expectations, places where she had been underestimated because it was easier than asking who she truly was. Those memories did not harden her expression. They steadied it. Officer Daniel Wright sensed the shift without fully understanding it, the way someone senses weather changing before the clouds arrive. His training had taught him to read resistance, to anticipate arguments and defiance, but it had not prepared him for restraint that refused to engage. He glanced again at the folder near Monica's side, noticing it properly for the first time, and felt an unease he could not place. Papers were common in courtrooms, but intention was not always visible, and that unsettled him. Monica's calm did not come from confidence in the room. It came from confidence beyond it. She had walked into the courthouse knowing the assumptions that would greet her, knowing the tone that would be used, the lines that would be drawn. She had also known how easily those lines could dissolve when exposed to patience. Her mind remained focused, not on vindication, but on timing. This was not the moment to speak. This was the moment to let the imbalance reveal itself fully. The gallery watched more closely now, attention sharpened by the sense that they were witnessing something rare, not confrontation, but control exercised quietly. A man near the aisle shifted forward, elbows on his knees, drawn in by the subtle gravity of the scene. A woman too rose back, stopped pretending to scroll through her phone, her eyes fixed on Monica with a mixture of curiosity and respect she had not expected to feel. The courtroom, once predictable, now felt uncertain of itself. Wright spoke again, but his words lacked the certainty they once carried. He referenced procedure, yet the sound of his own voice seemed to remind him how little procedure mattered without belief. Monica listened, not with submission but with discernment, hearing the strain beneath his composure. She understood that authority often grew louder when it sensed its limits. She also understood that the most effective response was sometimes none at all. The seal behind the bench seemed to watch over the room, its presence heavy with irony. Monica had dedicated years to working within systems like this, learning their strengths and their failures, recognizing when justice required patience rather than immediacy. She had been taught that the truth, when timed correctly, could reshape an entire narrative without raising a voice. Wright hesitated mid-sentence, aware that he was no longer directing the moment. The clerk shifted in her chair, fingers resting still atop her papers. The bailiff's gaze flicked once, more toward the judge's door, anticipation written plainly across his face. Monica remained still, her posture unchanged, yet her resolve deepened. This was the threshold, the point where the room began to understand that silence was not absence, but presence refined. The assumptions that had once filled the space now hovered awkwardly, unsupported. Monica Harris did not need to announce who she was. She needed only to wait, knowing that when the moment arrived, the truth would not need embellishment. The courtroom felt it too, the quiet certainty that whatever came next would not belong to the expectations they had carried in, but to the reality unfolding before them. The sound of the judge's door opening was not loud, but it carried authority enough to redraw the room in an instant, and every head turned as the judge entered, robes settling, presence anchoring the space that had felt unmoored for far too long. The bailiff announced the court in a steady voice, and people rose, then sat, the ritual resuming as if nothing unusual had happened, though everyone knew it had. Officer Daniel Wright straightened, relief flickering across his face as he leaned into the familiar order he trusted. The judge's eyes moved across the room, pausing briefly on Monica Harris, then on Wright, then on the stillness that lingered like a held breath. Proceedings began with formalities, but the undercurrent remained. When the judge addressed the matter at hand, Wright stepped forward, voice measured, attempting to frame the moment as routine, as a misunderstanding corrected by structure. He spoke carefully now, aware of the room's attention, choosing words meant to restore normalcy. Monica listened, her gaze steady, hands relaxed, waiting. The judge turned to her and invited her to speak, the invitation neutral but firm, the kind that assumed cooperation without presumption. Monica took a single step forward, not hurried, not hesitant, and the movement alone drew focus. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the moment. She introduced herself clearly, stating her name, then calmly identified her role, her credentials articulated with precision and restraint. The effect was immediate and profound. A murmur rippled and then died, as if the room collectively decided silence was the only appropriate response. The judge's expression shifted from procedural neutrality to attentive focus, eyes sharpening as understanding settled. A clerk's pen stopped mid-motion. A lawyer's mouth parted slightly then closed. Officer Wright froze, the words he had prepared suddenly irrelevant, his certainty dissolving as the implications took shape. Monica continued, outlining the scope of her authority and the reason for her presence. Not accusatory, not defensive, simply factual. Each sentence landed with quiet force, not because of volume, but because of clarity. The room absorbed the truth as it was presented, stripped of embellishment. Wright felt the weight of it then, the realization that the narrative he assumed had never been his to control. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second before returning to Monica, now seeing her fully for the first time, not as an interruption, but as a reckoning. The judge nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the significance of what had been revealed, then addressed the court with measured composure, instructing that proceedings would adjust accordingly. The seal behind the bench seemed to loom with renewed meaning, its promise no longer abstract. Monica finished speaking and stepped back, returning to stillness, her role clarified without a single raised voice. The courtroom remained quiet, not stunned by spectacle, but sobered by truth. People sat straighter. Assumptions shifted. The space itself felt altered, as if the walls had listened and learned. Officer Wright said nothing, his posture rigid, understanding that the silence he had tried to command had found a different owner. Monica Harris stood composed, her dignity intact, having transformed the room not by force, but by presence, by timing, by the simple act of being exactly who she was and allowing the truth to stand on its own. The courtroom moved differently after the truth had been spoken, as if the air itself had recalibrated to a new center of gravity. The judge addressed the room with deliberate calm, outlining next steps with precision, ensuring that process followed principle rather than assumption. Each directive landed with clarity, and with each one, the balance shifted further away from habit and toward accountability. Officer Daniel Wright stood rigid, listening as instructions reframed the moment he had tried to control. His badge no longer carried the same weight in his posture, not because it had been taken, but because it had been placed in proper context. The judge requested documentation, confirmations, and procedural acknowledgments, all routine on paper, yet unmistakably different in consequence. A clerk rose to assist, her movements brisk and focused, the neutrality of her role now aligned with the gravity of the situation. Monica Harris remained composed, responding when addressed, concise and factual, her words measured not to persuade but to inform. The gallery watched closely, sensing that this was not a spectacle but a reckoning carried out through order. A lawyer near the aisle adjusted his glasses, scribbling notes with a seriousness that had not been present earlier. A bailiff shifted position, posture straightening as the room settled into a renewed sense of purpose. The judge acknowledged Monica's role with professional respect, affirming jurisdiction and scope without flourish, and the affirmation resonated more strongly because it was understated. Wright was instructed to step back from the immediate proceedings, a temporary measure framed as protocol, yet unmistakable in its symbolism. He complied without argument. The motion small, the impact significant. No one cheered. No one whispered. The quiet was not celebratory. It was corrective. The court proceeded to address the matter that had brought everyone there, now reframed by the clarity introduced moments earlier. Questions were asked with care. Responses were recorded meticulously. The seal behind the bench seemed to hold steady, no longer ironic but earned through action. Monica listened, occasionally clarifying points, her demeanor steady, eyes attentive, presence grounding rather than dominating. She did not seek validation. She allowed the process to do what it was designed to do when guided properly. Wright remained silent, absorbing the shift as it unfolded, recognizing that authority without integrity could not sustain itself. The gallery's attention softened into reflection, faces thoughtful rather than tense, as the realization settled that fairness had not arrived through confrontation, but through exposure. The judge concluded the segment with clear instructions for follow-up, emphasizing standards that applied to everyone present, including those accustomed to standing above scrutiny. When a gavel came down, the sound was crisp and final, not dramatic, simply decisive. People began to move again, chairs sliding back gently, papers gathered with care, conversations deferred out of respect for what had just occurred. Monica stepped aside, allowing the flow of the room to resume, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. A few eyes followed her with new understanding, not curiosity, but acknowledgement. Officer Wright departed the immediate area under supervision consistent with policy, his steps measured, his focus inward. The courtroom did not erupt into noise as it emptied. Instead, it carried a subdued awareness, a shared understanding that something essential had been corrected without spectacle. Monica paused briefly near the exit, not to look back, but to breathe, knowing that justice did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, realigning a room, reminding everyone that accountability, when applied evenly, was the truest form of order. The courthouse gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something subtle remained altered, as if the building itself had absorbed the lesson of the morning. People exited through heavy doors into the daylight, their conversations quieter, more thoughtful than when they had arrived. Monica Harris stepped outside and paused beneath the wide stone steps, the city moving around her with the usual urgency of Chicago streets, horns sounding in the distance, footsteps echoing against concrete. She stood still for a moment, not out of fatigue, but out of reflection. Moments like the one she had just experienced rarely announced their significance at the time they occurred. Their meaning unfolded later, in changed behaviors, in questions asked more carefully, in authority exercised with restraint. Inside the courthouse, paperwork continued to move through hands that now understood its weight differently. Procedures were reviewed, statements documented, decisions logged with an awareness sharpened by accountability. Officer Daniel Wright was escorted through administrative halls he had walked countless times before, though today his steps felt different. He was not confronted with spectacle or humiliation, only with process applied evenly, and that reality unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. He understood now that the silence he once relied on had shifted, no longer protecting him, but holding him to a standard he could not ignore. Monica did not linger on his outcome. Her focus had never been on punishment. It had been on correction. She walked down the steps and into the flow of pedestrians, blending seamlessly into the city, her presence unremarkable to those who did not know what she had just done. That anonymity was not a loss. It was freedom. She had learned that justice did not require recognition to be effective. It required consistency. The courthouse behind her stood as it always had, stone and glass unchanged, yet within its walls something had recalibrated, however slightly. A clerk would remember the moment she avoided a gaze and later wished she had not. A lawyer would recall the stillness that forced him to reconsider what confidence looked like. A judge would remember the weight of measured words and the responsibility they carried. These are not dramatic shifts, but they were real. Monica continued down the sidewalk, her pace unhurried, her thoughts clear. She had seen how easily assumptions filled silence, and how quickly they dissolved when met with truth. She knew the work was ongoing, that one moment did not dismantle a system, but it could remind it of its purpose. That reminder mattered. It traveled quietly, carried by those who witnessed it and could not unsee it. Inside the courtroom, the seal behind the bench remained fixed, its promise unchanged, yet perhaps understood a little more honestly by those who passed beneath it. Justice had not thundered. It had whispered, firm and unmistakable, and the room had listened. Monica reached the corner and stopped at the crosswalk, waiting as the signal changed. Cars slowed, then stopped, and she stepped forward with the rest of the crowd, moving in sync with the city she served not by force, but by principle. She did not look back. She did not need to. What had mattered was not who she was revealed to be, but what the moment had revealed to everyone else. In that quiet recognition lay the truest form of accountability, the kind that did not end with a gavel, but echoed forward, reshaping choices yet to be made.